Hello, my name is April Fredrick. I am the soprano and producer for Her War, a new opera with music by Edwin Roxburgh and words by Jonathan Ruffle for the Tete a Tete 2020 festival about the female experience of PTSD in the wake of World War One. I am here with Denise Poynter, whose work on the female experience of shell shock was coalface, seminal, some of the first work done on a PhD doctoral level in this subject matter, which is shocking considering all that's been done on the male side. And I just wanted to talk to her a little bit about her PhD, how that came to be, the course of that, the kind of exciting moments she had during it, what she's taken away from it, and kind of how that's fed into being involved in our project. So, Denise, can you just tell us a little bit about it, your background to begin? Just help us get to know you.
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you for inviting me onto this project. I'm really excited about this, and it's kind of given me a nice little warm buzz inside. So my name's Denise. I currently work as a therapist, to be precise, a DBT therapist, which stands for dialectical behaviour therapy. I'm also currently training to be an emotionally focused therapist. As April said, I finished my DBT. I finished my PhD back in 2009, and I kind of let it go for a bit. As anybody who's done a PhD, I think because of the intensity and the work that's involved, it's just nice to have a bit of a break from it. But I've just been incredibly excited about this project and how it's now kind of coming back a little bit. I live in the Midlands. I'm in the UK. I live in the Midlands. I have a grown-up daughter. I have an interest in trauma and how it affects people, specifically war trauma. It seems like a strange interest to have, but it's always just held my attention, if you like. And yeah, as I started to look into the subject for my PhD, there were a lot of questions that I felt were unanswered, and particularly where do the women sit with this? So hence I was lucky enough to kind of pursue it with the support of a couple of great tutors at the time. So it's a big thank you to them as well. So yeah.
So, how did that actually come about? Did you intend to study the women to begin with, or what?
No, I didn't, and that's the curious part about it. I originally, after I'd finished my undergraduate studies, my tutor, a lady called Dr. Sally Sokoloff, she encouraged me to go for this interview for a studentship to start a PhD, and essentially it was in military history, and bless her, she won't mind me for saying this, but she said, I don't think you'll get it, but it'll be good experience for you to just go and see what this interview is like. So off I went. And it was a studentship, so I had to kind of present something. And as a consequence of the interest came because I was always fascinated by stories in my family and my grandparents, particularly one of my grandfathers who fought in the First World War. And it was always this mystery. It was, yes, your granddad was in the First World War, but we don't talk about it. Whatever you do, don't talk about it. And as I got older, I realized there was a huge impact on the family. There was potentially some violent outbursts and some aggression from him. And that had an impact on the family. So I guess at that point I was thinking, well, I wonder what shell shock did to soldiers' families. So that was my presentation for the studentship. And my supervisor was absolutely right. I didn't get the main military history one, but the interviewers phoned me up later and said, we were really intrigued by your proposal. We have gone off and found some more money. Would you like to come and do a PhD and look at your subject? So that's where it started. There was no nurses involved at that point. It was, how am I going to look and see what happened to the families? so yeah, it never originally started as a project to look at nurses, which, and I'm kind of glad it did now, but at the time I was going down a slightly different path. So yeah.
So, what was the hinge into looking directly at the effect on the nurses then?
Well, I struggled a little bit to find very much on the families, and coupled with the fact that my supervisor, who's, I think he's retired now, but Professor Ian Beckett, he said to me, when I said to him, I think I'm going to go down the route of looking at nurses, and his response was, well, good luck with that. He said, I don't think you'll find anything. Which is a little bit like a red rag to a bull, really. I thought, right, I'm going to go and find something. And I took a huge risk, I think, because I almost used I took up possibly the first year of my PhD just trying to find something. And I did start to get quite despondent because I thought, he's right. He said, I'm not going to find anything.
And
Slowly but surely, though, it started to emerge. So yeah, go on.
where do you look? So where are we investigating? How do you even decide where you're going to find that sort of source material?
Well, as I say, I came to a bit of a dead end with the families, although interestingly, as I started to research the nurses, the family element did come in. So that might be something to go forward with in the future. But as a nurse myself, a psychiatric nurse, I thought, well, lots of questions started to pop into my head, and I kept thinking, well, where are these nurses? They're supposed to be going over there to look after these soldiers, and are they so far removed from them to be protected from the shells, in which case they're going to be too far away from them to look after them and nurse them. So there's got to be a proximity to them that's closer than most of us were thinking. But I started to look at things like the Red Cross archives. Lots and lots of material I found at the National Archives once I knew where to look. Because one of the great guys down there actually said to me, have you thought about looking at the pension records? You might find lots of medical, because there's a lot of medical records in the pension records, and that was a great route to go down. I also had to go around quite a lot of little local archives because there were quite a few things, so I travelled around a bit. But yeah, Red Cross archives, nursing, lots of diaries were great as well. But of course there's a problem with that because only middle class nurses kept diaries, a lot of the working class didn't. So there's a few biases I had to kind of tackle, but once I kind of found a little source, it was like a proverbial tree branch. They started peeling off into other little areas for me, which was great. So.
And were you supported as you'd, I think, maybe hoped as you were kind of going into this? And so what was the attitude of your faculty? Were they thinking, yes, you're doing really intriguing research, or was this kind of accepted by the establishment because it was something that really hadn't necessarily been delved into before?
There was support. I can't say I wasn't supported, but there was a little bit of an attitude or an approach, because I think even though it was, I mean, we're not talking very, very long ago. I finished it in 2009, so we're only talking about the turn of the century here. And when I started, because it did take me a little bit longer to do because I did it part-time, but I was a bit taken aback, I think, by the attitude. It was, you won't find anything. And actually, on one of my interviews, I remember, I think it was the dean, he actually said to me, why is a woman studying military history? I said, are you saying I can't do it? No. And I think he kind of stepped back a little bit. But I think there was still a little bit of a kind of traditional conservative view. Nurses were not anywhere near the front line. Nurses were protected. You know, there's a famous phrase from one of the generals when a woman offered her services, and I think it went along the lines of, "My good woman, go home and sit still. This is man's business," or something like that. And yet, the more I delved into it, the more I realized there were a significant number of nurses there. And I suddenly thought, gosh, their story hasn't been told.
Yeah.
And then I started to get really excited. And then some support came. My female tutors were great. A couple of the male tutors were going, "Oh, I'm not sure about that." But it then that just spurred me on to say, well, it wasn't quite, I'm going to show you, but yeah, I'm going to put something down and make you think again about history and her story. So yeah, and I'm glad I did it. It took a little while. It was quite hard work at times, but I'm so glad I did it.
So you began to find records that kind of contradicted this idea that the women were just safely well behind lines.
Mm-hmm.
So what kinds of stories were you finding, or what sort of evidence kind of swayed your view to think, wait a second, they were a lot closer to the heart of things than that view would seem to indicate?
Several things really, because in some of the medical records that I was looking at, there were accounts of nurses having limbs blown off and being buried as a consequence of shell blasts, much like the soldiers were in the trenches. And that was a real kind of sit up and take notice story for me. I thought, gosh, where are these women that they're actually being caught by bombs and shells? And the other thing was a lot of the casualty clearing stations where they worked, initially they thought they were fairly stationary type places, but they kept having to be moved because they were being bombed. There were stories of nurses diving under beds and running into some kind of shelter, which was always interesting because they were actually in open ground. They didn't have the protection of the trenches, which the soldiers did, albeit that the trenches were portrayed as being awful places, and I'm sure they were. But they had a little bit of protection from the trenches, whereas the women didn't have that. There was some stories later on of nurses actually having to dig their own trenches for cover. But then what happened was quite a lot of the accounts were of nurses experiencing a lot of psychological symptoms, and then I thought, gosh, what's going on here? This is very similar to what I've been reading about the men. So it just started to answer a lot of my questions and also leave a lot of questions unanswered. So I just really kind of got stuck into it at that point.
Now this is kind of a side question, but just almost just from my own clarity of thought, what sorts of structures were the casualty clearing stations? Were they buildings? Were they tents? Where were they actually working?
It was a little bit of both. There was a lot of tents, and they commandeered a lot of like the French farmhouses and things, and manor houses and whatever. They would kind of go in and commandeer and turn things over to the military. But there were also the casualty clearing stations would have been tent type structures that they would have had to move. So yeah, it was a little bit of a mixture of the both. And really sort of far forward, you might have had first aid posts that I don't think women were quite there, but they operated the transport to move backwards and forwards between those places. So, and they also operated on the trains. There were a lot of trains that were turned over to ambulance type transport as well. So pretty
And
close, really.
yeah, so were there any women who were kind of right up just behind the front lines?
There were one or two because women had to kind of go out under their own steam. There are stories of women who managed to get lorries and transport together and go out under their own steam, especially in the early years of the war. And there were, I think I've forgotten her name. I think you mentioned it to me.
But Elsie Knocker? And
Yes,
uh,
and somebody
Google?
Sandys, yeah, she there were stories of a couple of women that actually were allowed to fight in the trenches in on I can't remember what. I'll check that and come back. But in the early years, like 1914, 15, there was a lot of women, philanthropic kind of teams going out and going out under their own steam. Um, Once they realised, of course, that a lot of these soldiers were being injured and they needed some kind of first aid and nursing service, that's when the nurses were taken out and conscripted, if you like, to go out there and do a bit more of a military role as a military nurse. So a few more things were set up for them after that stage.
And
So
then I suppose one other question. So what kind of conditions were they actually having to work under in terms of what sorts of supplies did they have? Were they able to give anesthetic? What kind of sterilization did they have? I mean, so just thinking of a nurse trying to do her job in a tent after a big push, like what did that actually mean for them trying to save lives?
um, well, in as you can imagine, in that period, a lot of the things that we take for granted now were just being kind of invented and evolved. So there wouldn't have been quite the aseptic techniques that we have now. Um, Antibiotics were in their infancy, if they were there at all. Painkillers, that kind of thing, were all um, pretty novel. Um, a lot of bandages had to be washed and reused, that kind of thing. And of course, with the nurses, we had qualified nurses and voluntary aid detachments, and the voluntary aid detachments tended to do all that heavy duty washing, sterilizing work, keeping things clean. Um, and a lot of the nurses' role was involved in kind of laundry, keeping, that kind of thing, which was you can see them from their accounts, having to not only look after the soldiers, but having to fill quite a long day, trying to keep all the other things kind of ticking over as well. So
Mm.
not an easy life, I don't think.
No, no. It's you've got the kind of the I suppose the danger of the bombardments, and then trying to kind of to look after the soldiers. And how long like would a nurse tend to kind of be looking after a soldier before he passed through her hands and went on somewhere else?
Um, so the nurses, the duties, they tend to be very, very long hours. They would, which was another thing that kind of contributed, as it would in soldiers, that they were quite sleep deprived, and quite dirty a lot of the time. Their clothes sometimes had to kind of go into work in the same uniform a couple of days at a time, 3 or 4 days at a time. Um, but they could sometimes, from the accounts I read, they could sometimes be on duty for 3 or 4 days at a time with only very short periods of sleep. Um, and that was particularly so when there was heavy bombardments, for instance, in the Somme and things like that, because the nurses had that commitment and that sense of duty that if these soldiers are actually giving up their sleep and their time to, fight, then we're going to do the same. They very much wanted to be seen as on a par with the men in terms of a frontline duty. And there were a lot of accounts where they were saying, I worked 14, 15, 18 hours and had like 3 or 4 hours sleep, and then I'd get called out of my bed because another train load had just come in, and then they had to get up and start again. So yeah, pretty lot. And I think they in terms of nursing the soldiers, they could actually be with them for quite some time. um, there were stories of them getting quite attached, and also the worst thing for a nurse is that they were most times you go in to be a nurse in order to look after somebody and get them well and see them on the way, but of course in this instance you're getting them well to put them back in the front line and that wouldn't have sat comfortably with a lot of them. So yeah, that's traumatic in itself, I guess.
Yeah. So as you were kind of reading all these accounts and going into the National Archive, did you have any kind of eureka moments, with particular documents where you thought, this is why I put in the time, this is what I've been looking for?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I remember one particularly because having kind of gone skeptically into this, having the voice of my supervisor in my ear saying, I don't think you'll find anything, and kind of good luck with that. And having spent a good sort of 8 to 12 months searching through and not finding anything substantial, on one occasion down at the National Archives, and for anybody who's ever visited there, it's very quiet and, white gloves, and, you have to be very respectful and very polite and everything. That's how it was at the time anyway. And I pulled this file out and was going through it without kind of thinking anything particular. And then there it sat in front of me. The report on her transfer was shell shock. And I for a brief moment had to read it again, and then without thinking I kind of leapt up and squeaked a little bit, and then remembered where I was and kind of thought, oh gosh, this is really embarrassing. But yeah, that was kind of an important moment, because I had actually found more than what I was looking for in a way. Here was a doctor saying this nurse has got shell shock. Hence the title of the thesis, because I had to use that. There was no way I was going to not use that. So yeah, that was a little bit of an embarrassment.
But amazing, isn't it, that you would have had to look so long, to find somebody saying what when we look back we think, well, of course, that if they're exposed to the same conditions, of course they'd be experiencing trauma. But I suppose it's so easy for us to forget how little they understood about trauma generally, and they didn't even know what to do with the men, let alone the women.
Exactly. Yeah.
And and then
Because that's how it all. Sorry, go on.
no, please.
No, I was going to say that's kind of a little bit of how it came about for me, because I'd spent such a lot of time looking into the whole phenomenon of shell shock, and reading all about Sassoon and Owen and all the other war poets, and that was my introduction into it. But the more and more I understood it, because as a medical condition, shell shock doesn't exist. It never existed. You cannot develop these symptoms as being in proximity to an exploding shell. I mean, they tried to put that together with a theory of commotion and concussion and knocking people out, which of course it would have done. But when they realized what the symptoms were, that was too close to women's hysteria. And of course they couldn't then claim that all these men were hysterical, because that didn't go down well in terms of courage and bravery, and so it was a term that was invented really to keep that masculinity there. But then when I looked into the symptoms, I thought, gosh, everything that the soldiers are suffering from, these nurses are suffering from. So the symptoms were identical. So that's, and then realizing they were closer to the front line than many people had realized. So there's it's been a myth that women have not had these symptoms, and they've been protected from the front line. So it was all starting to come together then.
And so, until you found that one document with shell shock on, what kind of diagnoses were they giving? So, if there were women with similar symptoms, if they weren't saying, well, you have shell shock, what were they saying that they had?
So the two most common ones were things were neurasthenia, which was kind of a nervous neurological kind of label that covered quite a lot of things. Disordered action of the heart was another one. But what they were finding was that people who were incredibly anxious their heart rates were being affected. So, you know, a lot of cardiologists were coming in and saying, what's wrong with this person's heart? And they came up with the disordered action of the heart label. But it just seemed that they were, because their threat systems were triggered. You know, they were on high alert the whole time. And if you're on high alert and you're anxious 24/7, your heart rate is going to be beating a lot faster than normal. So,
Yeah.
but it was interesting, all the different, because it was an evolving thing. You know, a lot of the doctors and the psychologists and the neurologists, they didn't know what they were looking at either. So it was evolving throughout the years of the war.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Now, I know that during my PhD in Ivor Gurney, he sort of kept me company for a long time and became sort of quite dear to me as a person. Did you experience anything similar with any of the women that you were researching?
I'm smiling, and I'm also grateful for you saying that, because I kept thinking, gosh, I'm living with ghosts of these women, and I started to kind of worry a little bit about myself, because I found myself, you know, I still remember their names now. But yes, I jokingly said to a friend of mine, I'm living with about 300 or 400 dead nurses at the minute, and it that sounds, in that sense, it sounds a little bit creepy when you say it like that, but actually, having read their files and their experiences, they became real. They became people I wanted, you know, and I have to say, I kind of enjoyed being with them. um, and I started to feel like I wanted to do them some kind of honor, that they actually hadn't had their voices heard. And you know, I kind of didn't mind having them with me, and I hope they didn't mind me having being with them. But um, yeah, I definitely lived with them for a little while. So I'm pleased to hear you say that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I remember I went to a stage show about Gurney that was written by Ian Burnside that was kind of weaving together some of the letters and poems and some of the songs, and it involved um, Gurney once he had been committed to asylum, probably for manic depressive illness, and I wanted to crawl out of my seat. Like, it was excruciating just to
Mm,
see someone that I knew that I cared about, but it was almost like seeing a family member, a spouse, like just exposed on the stage
mm,
that way. And you're just like, I can't bear
mm,
this. I can't bear this. And
mm,
you never realize
mm.
like, how much you've taken on their cause until you see it
Yes,
through someone
yeah.
else's eyes, and you sort of think, I hate this. Like, I cannot bear this. And
Yeah, there was those moments, as I'm sure lots of people when they do a PhD, and they probably familiarize yourself with this, but there were times when I thought, I really don't want to do this anymore. I'm just going to pop it in the bin. And I almost think it was their voices that were saying, no, don't, keep going. so, so they almost, in a way, they motivated me as well. So yeah, I have a great debt of gratitude to these ladies, to these women. So
mm.
yeah.
And then in the wake of your PhD, you've been asked to kind of speak in various capacities. Are there any moments when you've sort of seen the penny drop for someone in the audience, or you've been able to sort of see what you might call, I suppose, the redemptive fruit of all your hard work
Mm.
for someone else?
Yes, I had a very particular moment, all through the centenary years. So from 2014 through to 2018, I think I was speaking about a couple of times a year. Um, so I got asked to speak at the National Army Museum and the National Archives, because they were putting on various presentations and things. And I also got asked by the Royal College of Nursing if I would go to one of their evening seminars. Um, and obviously I said yes, and off I went. And initially they said it's just for about an hour and a half, and there's normally, because they're tending to be more historical in nature, what sometimes happens is you probably get about 30 or 40 retired nurses that just come along for the networking and that kind of thing. And I thought, no, that's absolutely great, and off I went. Just before I went down there, I got a phone call from them to say, we're going to have to change the venue because there's now 100 people want to come, which I thought, oh my gosh, this is really flattering. But so I did the talk, and as is sometimes happens, quite a few come up to you afterwards, and they'll say thank you and ask a few questions and whatever. And then out the corner of my eye, I'd noticed this younger lady, probably in her 30s, sort of hovering in the background. And she almost seemed to wait till everybody else had spoken. And as I was kind of packing up, she came up to me and she just said, "I'm so grateful to you." She said, "I'm actually a military nurse now." She said, and I'd served in, I think she said Afghanistan or Iraq. And she said, "You've just described quite a few symptoms that I've been experiencing recently." She said, and I was beginning to think she said, "I didn't really know what was happening to me." She said, and I didn't want to say anything to anybody. And she said, for a brief moment there, I thought I was going a little bit crazy. She said, "But you've kind of made me feel that I'm not." And she said, this has just been so meaningful to me. She said how grateful she was, and I never ever forget that. It actually just makes me feel quite tearful just thinking about it. Yeah, it was just such a powerful moment. I mean, yeah, I hope she then was able to go back and see somebody and do something about it, because it was important, for her. So
But
yeah,
isn't it
really.
amazing how our research on historical people isn't ever just about the past? And
Yeah,
we
exactly.
sort of
Yeah.
realize, oh, wait a second. So for instance, what if it's not just confined to military nurses, but
Mm,
what about all the other people who are living in war zones, and all
exactly.
the
Yeah.
people who fled Syria, and in Lebanon, and in the Yemen, where places that are being bombarded all the time, and and are kind of trying to get to the same thing, and children as well.
Mm, mm.
And just sort of thinking that maybe like this research, again, it's not just for the past, it's for now as well.
But yeah, I totally and absolutely agree, and I just hope. I mean, there's been this. It's a strange phenomenon. So the First World War, they found out so much about trauma and psychology, and how this was impacting on the men and the women. Um, and then, of course, once the First World War ended in 1918, it was like, that's it. We don't need to worry about this anymore. And all the lessons that were learned in the First World War, they had to relearn them again in the Second World War. And I think for a while, it was almost like, well, this is something that happens in war. So if we're not having a war, we don't have to worry about it. But thankfully, um, people have been pulling a lot of this together. Organizations like Combat Stress, and I mean, in the Vietnam War, PTSD was the label that was used then, and because we now have a greater understanding of trauma, sort of for like frontline workers, first responders, that kind of thing. So I like to think we can pull it all together, and just have so much of a greater understanding. And actually, I like to think that actually, although it was 100 years ago, that's actually not that long ago. There were people, they were just like us. They just wore different clothes, and in a slightly different period, but
But
they
also,
still experience the same thing. So
and as you were saying that, just with the memory of your grandfather, and actually, we had a rehearsal with Bill Banks Jones, the artistic director of Tete a Tete, who's helping us a bit as well, and he had a similar story of a relative who'd fought and died in the First World War that he hadn't even known about until a certain age, but it obviously profoundly affected the family. And
mm,
so this idea of inherited trauma, that it's still pretty close to us, just the memory of like
yeah,
what that sort of
definitely.
experience can do to somebody,
Mm,
and the ripple effects of that.
mm,
But so as you kind of went from the PhD, and we're still working as a psychiatric nurse, and kind of hinged into therapy, how did your research kind of, I suppose, impact your practice? And I mean, as your understanding of what trauma is, kind of changed and deepened through the work that you do now?
Um, I think it gave me I think it gave me a really good introduction and a grounding, because if I hadn't have done what I had done in my PhD, if I'd have gone into mental health now, um, trauma would have been kind of relatively a new subject, and I would have spent a lot of time learning about it. But to have that historical perspective, I think gives me I won't say a little edge, but it's given me a something that kind of sits here that just keeps me a little bit more informed. And I love the fact that when I do any training now, and I still train and keep myself up to date with things, I'm thinking, gosh, well, that bit hasn't changed very much. How we think about it is different, but to see um, how, as I say, there are lots of things that haven't changed dramatically. The thing that I find really quite interesting, I think, oh, if only I could have, with the knowledge I have now, I wonder what it would have been like to go back into that time and see, because I think there were so many men and women that really suffered unnecessarily, but not because people were ignoring them or whatever. They did, it was a new phenomenon, they just didn't know what to do. So and you're absolutely right about the generational link. I think because we're only talking about 2 or 3 generations from my grandparents, and yet I think there's still some links there. The children of these people are parents, and they're still affecting their children and their children. So but to have that historical perspective, it just feels like it adds a little bit of richness to what I'm studying now. So I'm really glad I did it.
And without wanting to kind of open a can of worms, like from where we sit now in history, and from the work that you do now, how would we define trauma now as versus maybe how they would have defined shell shock then?
That's a difficult question, because there are far more therapists who are far more well trained in trauma than I am. But my understanding, which is what I use as a really good working model when I try to explain it to other people, and when my clients explain it to me, it's essentially, and this also fits with the shell shock thing, which is why it's useful to have that historical knowledge. I think when something is so traumatic and so difficult for your body and your mind to process, there, as I understand it, there is a part of your mind that actually will kind of say, this is too much for you right now, this is way too much for you right now, we can't cope with this. So in order to kind of protect you and defend you, it's almost like the mind switches a couple of things off. It's almost like the mind is saying, I will get you through this, but in order to get you through this, I need to numb down some of the things that you're experiencing because they're too much, we can't process it. And what seems to happen then is that the person gets stuck in that experience. It's like the drama, because it's unprocessable. The person keeps reliving that drama until they can find a way to process it, and the emotion, it might get processed in a dysfunctional way. So intense fear, you're likely to kind of numb and so then everything becomes fearful. The slightest little thing, so your threat system is on high alert, and everything, you find threat in everything. And it's not until you're able to have some help from a really good therapist to be able to reprocess that experience for you and in a corrective way, that you start to be able to come out of it. As I say, that's my understanding, my working model, which I use for my therapies. But yeah, there might be other people that have a much more better explanation than me, but that kind of works for me.
But I mean, it makes total sense of, yeah,
Mm,
what you were saying of your grandfather's experience, that if he's stuck in the kind of fight flight mobilization
mm,
stage, so that's just if he's still perceiving threat,
yeah.
so if
And
that
that's why he wouldn't
has,
have wanted to talk about it, because actually to talk about it prompted him to think of that again, and he didn't want to relive that because it was too painful. So, and unfortunately, the way they dealt with it was to not talk about it, which meant he never ever processed it, which was sad. And the way it might have come out with the occasional outburst,
mm,
you know, created a picture of him that people were really scared of him.
mm,
Um, and actually, what he was probably doing was wanting to really connect with people
mm,
and be able to say, please understand me, I went through something awful. But his behavior is actually pushing people away. So there's this constant conflict going on, and which was never resolved,
mm.
which is so sad.
Were they
So
able to find any kind of relief talking to other soldiers who'd been through the same thing?
yes, and I think that's why we, the uh, because when you're in a because human beings are inherently, they want to attach, they're bonding creatures, unless you're a lizard or a robot, you will want to attach to other people. So you attach to your family, you attach to your loved ones, you even, it's not a thing that you have just in childhood, even as adults, you want to know that somebody's got your back, throughout your life. um and that for most people are members of their family. And when a soldier goes off into the military becomes their family. They leave their family behind and they go into a military family. And what's particularly special about a military family is then you have a shared experience. Nobody else understands what they went through except the people that were with them and went through it also. So they bond incredibly with their colleagues, their colleagues in the army, or the military, which makes it incredibly difficult when they come home, because they can't share what they were experiencing with civilians. So they try really, really hard to reconnect with their families, but there's this big gap there because there's this lack of understanding. So you find a lot of veterans gravitate back towards veteran societies, or they might want to then be on their own and seek solace in substances, which, there is that there's some figures that says an awful lot of homeless people are actually ex-servicemen,
Yeah.
because they obviously can't find a way to connect. So, which is again something that needs looking at. So
Yeah. But it is amazing that we have come further, and so
oh, absolutely, yeah.
there are so many new techniques, so things, I suppose, like the trauma release exercises that we were talking about earlier,
Mm,
that are, but also that are being developed to as techniques that can be passed on and
mm,
taught to kind of groups of people, so so either working through one-on-one with the therapist, but also just sort of thinking, where that's not possible, how can we teach you what's happening to you and how you
mm,
stop the cycle.
yeah.
And
And it's learning that, isn't it, and
yeah,
understanding that, and that's why this is happening,
yeah,
and if all this comes together, and our learning from history and where we are now and what we take forward, if that starts to come together and we start to understand that more, then yeah, I'm grateful to have been a part of it in a tiny small way. So
mm.
so yeah.
So if you had the chance to write anything more on this topic, or and kind of develop it further, where would you want to take it?
I thought about this, and I've thought about it several. I think I would want to go back to the family perspective, and I'm sure. I mean, I'm more than happy, because it won't be me writing it, but if it at least gives somebody else an idea, um, what what did happen to those nurses' families? How did they respond? Um, was it something that was carried on through generations, and link it in with the soldiers' experience. You know, what I mean, it sounds like a massive project. I don't know how you'd have to kind of narrow it down a little bit, but yeah, I think there's still scope to look into the family perspective, the family side of it,
Yeah.
and see how that generational trauma was continued or not continued, and what happened. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
because we never experienced anything in
Mm,
isolation.
no.
So, just a few last little things. I mean, what has it been like, sort of beginning to see this taken up into into a stage piece, into a libretto, and into a piece of music, and to think of this actually.
It's been amazing from when you first contacted me. I remember I'm almost had one of those little kind of eureka squeak moments again. Like, oh my gosh, you know, I got a really, really warm feeling, and you know, it's been so exciting, and I can't wait to see how it plays out and how it goes forward. Um and because it one thing that kind of popped into my head was that we have a limited amount of language to be able to explain how we feel and trauma, and especially when we have um, traumatic episodes, as in war. That's one of the reasons why I think people find it so difficult to talk about, because we don't have the language to say how distressing it was and how traumatic it was. But one thing I noticed specifically for myself is how music can evoke an emotion in a way that words can't. You know, there's music you can listen to that makes you feel really, really down, and then in the next minute you can play something and it lifts you. And it's something I use in therapy, you know, in order to demonstrate how your emotions can change. And I thought, gosh, this actually could be a really groundbreaking thing, in that if we can if we can use this and use music as the medium to express that,
Mm-hmm.
I think that will reach out to more people than people talking about it.
Mm.
So in that sense, I'm really excited.
It's been really interesting for me to just sort of see how Edwin, the composer, responded to it. And you know, he was very much sort of thinking of the character of the trumpet oftentimes as the male bureaucrat, you know, who's not understanding. So it's quite busy a lot of times. So it's like the lines are sort of quite combative. A lot of the time he has a lot of notes, and so it's almost like the sort of, you know, the teacher in Snoopy, wah, 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 just but
Yeah.
and then there are several points. So there's a lot of times when, as we've staged it, so he's behind me, but
Hmm.
then there are a few times when uh, it's much kind of sadder material, more kind of reflective, as versus kind of, you know, feisty. So I suppose it may be more the kind of like the immobilized state,
Hmm.
or just the, you know, the times of sadness and collapse. And so he's just very quietly sort of coming level to me. And but so this, it's more this idea of a duet as versus the confrontation, and sort of thinking
Mm.
of all the sympathetic people who were around, sort of saying that it wasn't just all antagonistic, you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
you know, around these women, but you know, generally. But one of the things that Edwin uses all the time, we were just talking about this in an interview with him, is this interval called the tritone. And so
Hmm.
this is it's the augmented fourth or diminished fifth. So it sounds like ba bum. So you might know it from things like Mars, the Bringer of War, the kind of
Hmm.
bum bum bum. But it's kind of the archetypical dissonance, and
Hmm.
it's everywhere, everywhere in the piece. But so to me, it sort of captures, like, as you're saying, like this state of not being resolved, continually
Hmm.
processing the thing and being caught
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
distress, and then then only literally in the last bars of the piece does there begin to be a little bit of resolution.
Hmm.
And so I'll kind of love to see what you make of the
I'm looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to it. And a little bit nervous as well.
When this is just the first part, but also the great thing about this is that it is still a work in progress. So we're bringing the first part of this, and this is our kind of, well, this is our best idea, but we also want to sort of be aware that it's only a start, and that's, I think, certainly for me, thinking if I'm trying to kind of portray something that's accurate to people's experience, I'm trying to kind of find my way into something that I haven't experienced myself.
Mm,
It's certainly not on the scale, that they would have. And so just
mm,
being kind of very humble and mindful about that, and wanting to kind of
mm,
take on feedback from people who have been through it, to either say, nope, that wasn't like that at all, or yeah, that worked. No, you need to do a lot more of that. Don't bother with that.
yeah.
Just no. Um,
But wouldn't that be great if veterans, male and female, did actually step forward and were, because as exactly as you say, this is a work in progress. So and if we can reach out from this and get them to come in and say, no, it wasn't like that, or yes, it was like that, and thank you. That's kind of what we're trying to do. I think
yeah.
that would be amazing. I think
I
it's
did
where
spend.
my nervousness comes in, I think. So
Yes, yes, because you think, oh, this might be quite difficult, but for you to
yeah.
hear, but at the same time, it's like, if can you hear our heart, which is to say,
Mm, mm.
we want to tell your story. I have sort of sent out emails to a lot of veterans charities, but funnily enough, there's not really a dedicated channel for works of art created to talk about their experience. Uh,
Surprising.
Trying to kind of, get through to them, but
Yeah,
that's definitely something that I am interested in sort of
yeah,
finding
yeah,
some
me too.
redemption from the difficulties. So kind of watch this space.
Mm.
I suppose finally is one last thing. We might just kind of put this as a little descriptor under the video as well, but where could people just go if even if as they watch this, they sort of they actually realize that some things are being triggered for them, or where could people go to learn more about PTSD or more about trauma?
I hate to say this, but Google it. There's so much out there. I would suggest they're going to kind of more recognised agencies like the NHS, Mind, uh, all kinds of different places that there are societies for the study of trauma,
Yeah.
and if it is something that has affected you, it is worth just getting a little bit of help, because we're all human and we can all be affected by things, and it doesn't mean there's anything particularly wrong or worrying. It just means that what I would say is, great, your emotions are intact. You're normal, you're human. um, I mean, I can say, some of the things I was reading about from these nurses, I could feel it. You put it, I won't say I was traumatized vicariously, um, but it's sometimes when you have things, when you hear things and you see things, and you read about stuff, you have that image in your head then, and once it's in your head, it's very difficult to let go of. And we all, as I say, we're all human beings. We do just need that little bit of help sometimes. And I say, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong. It means that you're actually caring and you're empathic, which is a great thing. But yeah, there are lots of places. I might just give my colleagues a little plug at this point, but I currently work with Mind Reframed Limited, and we're a group of therapists who are just absolutely dedicated to supporting people with all kinds of dysregulated emotion problems, and some great therapists there. So
Amazing. Well, Denise, thank you so much for your time, for being so generous and open with
no, thank you, thank you. I'm feel very privileged and very honoured to be included in a part of this, and I'd say I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward to it, and seeing how it develops. Yeah, it's evolving. I love to sit and watch it, so, and be a part of it. So thank you.
Amazing. Well, we'll touch base after next week's premiere and sort of see where we go from there. Right. Thank you
Brilliant.
so much, and we'll see you soon.